The vision continues. More interesting symbolic figures. What do we have as we get into chapter 12? Who's this woman?
Ooh, yeah, this is, I think, in many ways, the central set of visions of the whole book, chapters 12 through 14, starting with the woman clothed with the sun.
Right.
We have 7 of them. They're not numbered like the trumpets or the seals were in the previous chapters, but each of these visions begins with the same formula, and I saw.
Yeah.
So the author is again thinking in terms of 7. And the first 3 visions, which occupy chapters 12 and 13, are all of the enemy, if you will.
Yeah.
And then the next visions are of the good guys.
Mm-hmm.
So let's think about the
bad guys.
the bad guys to
Yeah.
begin with. Well, the woman is actually a
The
good
woman's-
gal.
yeah,
And we have 2 important feminine images in the book. Actually 3. We have the woman clothed with the sun,
Right.
who in some ways is the mother of the Messiah.
Yeah.
And we'll have to think a little
Yeah.
bit more about that.
Yeah.
And then we have the whore of Babylon in chapter 17, and we'll have to think about that. And
Yeah.
then the bride of the Lamb
At the end. Yeah.
So there are these 3 very potent images that call on lots of symbolic traditions
Yeah.
out of the Old Testament and out of contemporary mythology and art, for that
Yeah.
matter. I think the woman clothed with the sun here, with the moon under her feet and on her head a crown of 12 stars, is an image that has been used in the Christian tradition for Mary,
Very much so.
the mother of
Yeah.
Jesus. And it appears all over the place,
Yeah.
And I think we have some pictures
We
in
do.
the written material here that
Yeah.
illustrates that.
Yeah.
But in any case, the imagery I think is a little more complicated than just a depiction of the glorified Mary. This image of a cosmic presence comes out of Greco-Roman religion, and I think it's referring to deities like Artemis, the goddess of Ephesus, or other Greco-Roman deities of one sort or another that had some sort of cosmic dimension. But this is being used of the mother of the Messiah in I believe, a corporate sense rather than an individual sense. It's the people of Israel that's,
okay,
I think, being depicted here. And I gather that from the way in which the mother and her child are persecuted by the great serpent in chapter 13, verse 13. So what's depicted here at the beginning of chapter 12 is an ancient mythic paradigm or archetype of a woman, a pregnant woman and her child, a woman who has divine dimensions to her, being threatened by some sort of inimical power of evil. There's a story told about Leto and her children, Apollo and Diana, of precisely this sort.
Here we are. Yeah.
So it's there in ancient mythology, and you could find parallels in ancient Near Eastern mythology too, of Marduk and Tiamat, battles between some sort of serpent and some sort of power of good. So our author is conjuring up powerful imagery that could be read in a number of ways. He tells us how to read it, especially with the serpent that's threatening the woman and her child. The serpent is the ancient serpent, he says in verse 9.
Right.
The devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world. So it's clear that he's setting up a fundamental dichotomy between the forces of good and the forces of evil, forces of good represented by mother and messianic child, and the forces of evil represented by Satan. The most important part of this image is, I think, in verse 9, that Satan has been thrown down. And this, again, conjures up all sorts of mythical combat imagery between good guys and bad guys. We're familiar with it in the West, St. George and the dragon,
right.
but it's a very widespread image. The key point here is that Satan has been thrown down to earth, been defeated in some way. He's down, but he's not out. And that's important for the sequence
both
that follows.
sides of that are important.
That's right. That's right. And that victory has already been celebrated here in verse 10. So this picks up the celebratory note that we heard at the end of chapter 11, that hallelujah chorus, right? And in chapter 12, verse 10, now have come the salvation and power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of the Messiah. For the accuser of our comrades, our brethren, has been thrown down. Again, there's a connection here between the experience of the community, the experience of persecution that we've talked about before, and this primordial myth.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah, very good.
That continues throughout chapter 12, the notion that there's a combat between these two forces, the fundamental forces. Okay?
So how does the heaven-earth thing happen? Heavenly victory assured, earthly battle still going on.
Earthly battle still going on, and we're going to see how that battle unfolds in chapter 13.
Okay, all right.
Because we have here, as I said, in the first visions here in the sequence, a list of the enemy. And the first enemy is the devil, Satan, if you will. The next enemy in chapter 13, verses 1 through 10, is a beast from the sea.
Yeah.
And remember where we are, theoretically, and seeing this vision. We're on the western coast of Asia Minor.
Right.
And so the sea you're looking at is the Aegean, and what comes to you from over the sea is Roman imperial power.
Nice, okay.
So
nice
it's
point. Nice,
pretty
nice.
clear that what goes on with this beast from the sea is a notion that the forces of ultimate evil that have been described in the first vision are now embodied. They're incarnate in Rome.
Power, yeah.
And it's a kind of bizarre image that we have here, a beast with 10 horns and 7 heads and 10 diadems on the horns. Attempts to portray this artistically are all very amusing. I think they're very difficult to imagine. And then the beast is a composite of various kinds of animals, a leopard and a bear and a lion. So it's really a kind of postmodern, post-realist kind of thing, more than impressionism, cubism, if you will. All of this imagery is coming from Daniel. And in Daniel chapter 7, before we get to the image of the one like a son of man, we have images of various imperial powers that had impressed Israel of old, and they're all depicted as beasts. Okay. All of those beasts are amalgamated here into one beast that is Rome. Yeah. Okay?
Yeah.
And the beast has, according to verse 5, a mouth that utters haughty and blasphemous words and is allowed to exercise authority for 42 months. This is the same limited period of time, the time, 2 times and half a time, 3.5 years on a lunar calendar that was referred to back there in chapter 11. So the authority of this beast is for a limited period, is what the author is saying, alluding again to Daniel.
Patriotic slogans or imperial praises?
Probably, yes. It opened its mouth to utter blasphemies against God, blaspheming his name and his dwelling, that is, those who dwell in heaven, by identifying itself with heavenly power. Right, I think that's what's going on. And it's clearly Roman imperial power that's referred to. It has authority over every tribe and people and language and nation and all the inhabitants of the earth. Okay?
Very good.
And then there's a little poetic tag at the end of this, which is a message to those who resist or stand in confrontation with this power. Let anyone who has an ear listen. If you are to be taken captive, into captivity you will go. Mm-hmm. If you kill with the sword you must be killed. I think this is a call to passive resistance.
I do too,
It's a call not to take up the sword, as did the revolutionaries against Rome back in the 60s. It's a call to bear witness, and if you have to suffer for it, fine. But don't take up the sword.
And then, as we saw at the very beginning, the suffering is his own victory.
That's right. That's right.
Paradoxically.
It's a share in the victory won by the slain lamb.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so that's the second vision, and the beast from the sea. And then there's a third vision. I saw, again, in chapter 13, verse 11, and this is a beast that comes out of the earth. And it mimics the other beasts. It has 2 horns, like a lamb, and it spoke like a dragon, so it has features of both positive and negative animals that we've seen, right? And it exercises the authority of the first beast on its behalf. So what's going on here? I think what we're talking about is the aristocracy of the cities of Asia Minor. And we know from historical sources that there was a competition to observe the rites of Roman religion, to be custodians of the temple of Rome and Caesar among some of these cities.
Right.
The ruling classes of this area bought into the imperial system, and they found it to be a source of peace and prosperity for themselves. And so I think that's what's being referred to here, their buy-in to the imperial system.
Well, we need to circle back for just a minute to say something about the number of the beast.
The number of the beast, yes.
Much used.
Right, we're going to be coming up to that number at the end of the chapter, chapter 13, verse 18.
Yeah.
And this is tied in with the way in which this beast from the land exercises its authority on behalf of the Roman imperial power. And it does two things.
Okay.
It enforces worship of the first beast, the Roman imperial power, and that's what we hear in verses 14. It deceives the inhabitants of the earth, telling them to make an image for the beast, that is, the beast from the sea, that had been wounded by the sword and yet lived. This is an allusion, I think, to the assassination of Nero in 68.
Oh, okay.
We're going to be hearing about that again in chapter 17.
Right.
And there's also an allusion here to what goes on in some aspects of pagan cult in verse 15. It, that is, the beast from the land, was allowed to give breath to the image of the beast so that the image of the beast could speak. We have reports from a 2nd century satirist named Lucian about a false prophet named Alexander of Aboniticus, who had a serpent, a puppet, that he used to give voice to divine proclamations.
Interesting.
This is an allusion to precisely that kind of thing. So the author is alluding to the kinds of cultic activity that went on in his environment. This beast here from the land causes worship of and enforces worship of the beast from the sea. And for those who don't worship the beast from the sea, they get killed, according to verse 15. So this is where the persecution is coming from, that the author has been referring to on numerous occasions. There's another thing that the author says, though. All right, so there's idolatry going on. There's false worship, and he wants to preserve his community from that. But there's also some sort of economic oppression, and he's very clever about how this works. Verse 16 and following.
Right.
It, the beast from the land, causes all, both great and small, rich and poor, slave and free. Sounds an awful lot like Galatians 3:28 and the way in which the community of early Christians is defined. Causes these people to be marked on the right hand and the forehead. They're marked in a way that parodies the sealing or marking of the 144,000 back in chapter 7.
Where they're anointing.
And it also parodies or is kind of a diabolic equivalent of how Orthodox Jews would mark themselves at time of prayer by putting phylacteries to fill in on their arms and on their foreheads. So this is the diabolic equivalent of Orthodox worship in various ways. But how does that happen? Are people actually putting on to fill in? I don't think so. And the author gives us a hint here. This calls for wisdom. Let anyone with understanding calculate the number of the beast. And you have to go back to the beginning of verse 17 to get what he's talking about. When you do all of this marking, you then can buy and sell. If you don't have the mark, you can't buy and sell. What's he talking about? Is it a physical mark here, or is it what you get on coins with which you buy and sell? I think, you see, he's referring here in with the parody of tefillin to good luck gestures, like looking at a coin on your head, flipping a coin, or holding a coin to your forehead and saying, God be with us, or something. So there's some sort of parody going on that appeals to local custom, all having to do with a coin. And on the coin, you get the image of the beast and you get the name of the beast. And what the author is doing here in 13:18 is referring to the fact that in Greek and in Hebrew, you refer to numbers with letters of the alphabet. And so any name will have a numerical equivalent, and you can play guessing games. And so he says, I'm thinking of a name, and it has the numerical equivalent of 666. What is that? It's probably Nero Caesar in Hebrew. That works. And Nero, of course, has been alluded to with the wound that has been inflicted on the beast, the wound that was healed. So I think we have simply an allusion to Nero,
himself.
as the archetypical Roman emperor. Whether he's the actual Roman emperor is another matter.
So 14, are we getting hope again?
Yeah,
Judgment
14 and going into 15, we
Yeah.
have the good guys lined up.
Yeah.
Very quickly in 14, we have the Lamb. We've heard about the Lamb before, and he's standing on Mount Zion, and he's surrounded by angels, and the angels, among other things, give their positive messages about preservation of those who are in the Lamb's
Right,
camp.
right.
They also sound a new note here in chapter 14, verse 8. That is, fallen is Babylon the Great.
Yeah.
Announcing as a fait accompli something
we're
that
looking
might
for.
be a hope, either an eschatological hope or a short-time political hope.
or both.
They announce it here.
Yeah.
And that theme is then going to carry through the next several chapters, the celebration of the fall of Babylon, which hasn't taken place yet.
Right.
Okay?
Terrific.
Okay, so there we are. And then we have the rest for their labors that's proclaimed for those who follow in the footsteps of the Lamb. The victory seems to be won or half won.
Yeah, one foot,
It's a
one
little,
foot in, one foot
little
out.
bit
Yeah,
ambiguous,
little
isn't it?
ambiguous, yeah. All right, we'll carry on with the next chapter in a few minutes.